Texas was never supposed to feel like this. People in the Panhandle were not waiting for a violent jolt before sunrise. They were not expecting walls to creak, pictures to shift, beds to tremble, and that split second of confusion when your brain tries to decide whether it was thunder, wind, a heavy truck, or the earth itself. But on the morning of July 23rd, that is exactly what happened. A magnitude 5.0 earthquake struck about 38 kilometers south-southeast of Spearman, Texas, at a shallow depth of roughly 5.7 kilometers, and in one moment, a state that still thinks of earthquakes as somebody else's problem was forced to look at itself differently. This was not just another small tremor buried deep in a data feed. This was one of the strongest earthquakes to hit that part of Texas in more than a century. And the most unsettling part is not only that it happened, it is that scientists are still working to understand why. That question is what makes this story bigger than one morning of shaking. If this had happened on the edge of California, most people would react with concern, but not disbelief. California is part of the public imagination. People expect faults there. They expect sirens, drills, retrofits, seismic maps, constant reminders that the ground below them is part of an active boundary. Texas is different. Texas is supposed to be about open land, oil fields, wind, drought, storms, and heat. It is not supposed to be about a 5.0 earthquake waking people across multiple counties and shaking parts of western Oklahoma as well. That emotional mismatch is exactly why this event hit so hard. It did not only shake houses, it shook assumptions. And once assumptions start moving, a simple local event becomes a much bigger national conversation. The earthquake itself was not hidden in technical language. The numbers were clear. USGS reviewed it at magnitude 5.0. The location was near Spearman in the Panhandle. The depth was shallow enough to make the shaking feel more immediate at the surface. Hundreds of people reported feeling it. The felt intensity data climbed high enough to show this was more than a curiosity. Even more telling, USGS labeled the event as the potential main shock of an earthquake sequence. That matters because it means scientists did not treat it like noise. They treated it as a real event with real context and possible follow-up implications. And when a place like the Texas Panhandle generates a reviewed 5.0 earthquake, the central question is not whether people noticed. Of course they noticed. The real question is whether the ground there is changing in a way people have not fully accepted yet. To understand why this is such a powerful topic, you have to look at the strange geography of earthquake expectations in America. Most people mentally divide the country into safe places and seismic places. Alaska, California, parts of the Pacific Northwest, maybe Utah or Nevada, those feel seismic. Texas does not. But that mental map is much simpler than the real one. Earthquakes do not only happen on the most famous plate boundaries. They can happen inside tectonic plates as well. Old buried faults can reactivate. Stress can be transferred over long distances. Fluids injected underground can alter fault pressures. Ancient geology does not disappear just because a state built its identity around energy production and wide horizons. The crust keeps its own memory. And sometimes it releases that memory when people least expect it. That is where the real intrigue begins. Scientists are not investigating this event because earthquakes in Texas are impossible. They are investigating because a magnitude 5.0 in that location sits right at the uncomfortable intersection of two explanations that both matter. One explanation is natural tectonic activity on pre-existing faults. The other is induced seismicity, the kind of earthquake activity that can be influenced by human industrial operations, especially the deep injection of wastewater associated with oil and gas production. The hard part is that the public wants one clean answer immediately, but science rarely works that way in the first days after a significant earthquake. Instead, researchers have to compare timing, location, depth, fault geometry, nearby industrial activity, historical seismicity, and the broader regional stress field. In other words, they have to ask whether Texas shook because the crust would have moved anyway, because human activity helped push it closer to failure, or because both factors worked together. That uncertainty is exactly why this topic is so strong for your channel. It has surprise, danger, mystery, science, controversy, and a clear question at the center. A quake in California says one thing. A quake in the Texas Panhandle says something much more unsettling. It says the places Americans think are quiet may not be as quiet as they seem. It says the ground under some of the country's biggest energy regions may be under stresses the average person never thinks about. It says modern seismic risk is no longer a story that belongs to one coastline. And it says that in the middle of all the noise around weather, politics, and energy, the Earth can still interrupt the conversation in a few seconds, and force everyone back to fundamentals. But let us slow this down because the details matter. Local officials described the shaking as strong enough to wake people and rattle homes, but by the first reports there was no sign of catastrophic damage. That contrast is important. The event was serious, but it was not a city-flattening disaster. That means the real power of the story lies in what it reveals, rather than the destruction it caused. Pipelines had to be checked. Pressure systems had to be inspected. Emergency managers in rural counties suddenly had to think about an earthquake playbook they do not normally use. One county judge admitted there was no earthquake section in the county's emergency plan because earthquakes are simply not part of the routine threat picture there. And that may be the most revealing detail of all. The ground moved faster than the bureaucracy expected it to. That gap between risk and readiness is where long-term danger lives. Places that expect hurricanes prepare one way. Places that expect tornadoes prepare another. Places that expect earthquakes build for them, drill for them, and teach people how to react. But when an earthquake strikes a place that does not culturally think of itself as earthquake country, the event does more than produce shaking. It exposes the weak spots in planning, in public awareness, in infrastructure assumptions, and in the psychology of the region. The people of the Texas Panhandle are not used to asking whether a cracked wall came from a shifting foundation, summer dryness, or an earthquake. They are not used to scanning ceilings after a quake or wondering if aftershocks might follow. They are not used to thinking of buried faults under the plains as active pieces of a live system. That unfamiliarity amplifies the event far beyond its raw magnitude. And yet, this did not come out of nowhere in the broader American seismic story. Over the last decade, central U.S. earthquake discussions have changed dramatically. USGS has devoted major effort to induced earthquakes because sudden increases in seismicity in parts of the central and eastern United States have been linked to human activity, especially fluid injection. Scientists have used temporary seismic stations, hazard models, and numerical simulations to understand how injection and extraction can alter underground pressure conditions and influence faults that were already close to slipping. This does not mean every Texas earthquake is man-made. It does mean the old idea that seismic hazard in the middle of the country is purely natural, stable, and easy to ignore is no longer good enough. The science has become more complicated, and the public conversation has not fully caught up. So how can injecting fluid underground help trigger earthquakes? The concept is surprisingly simple, even if the geology is not. Deep underground, faults can remain locked because friction keeps one side from sliding past the other. When fluids are injected into certain formations, the pressure in pore spaces can rise. That extra pressure can effectively reduce the frictional resistance holding a fault in place. If the fault was already near failure, the added pressure can become the last push it needed. Think of a heavy object balanced on a slope. Gravity was already there. The slope was already there. The instability already existed. The fluid pressure can act like the final nudge. The earthquake still occurs on a real fault under real tectonic stress, but human activity may influence the timing and the trigger. This is where people often get confused. They imagine induced earthquakes as somehow fake, as if the ground only pretends to move because humans interfered with it. That is not how it works. If an earthquake is induced, the shaking is still real, the fault is still real, and the consequences are still real. What changes is the triggering context. Human operations may alter the underground conditions enough to release energy sooner, in a different way, or in a different sequence than would have happened naturally. That is what makes induced seismicity so uncomfortable. It blurs the line between natural hazard and industrial risk. It tells us that the energy economy and the crust beneath it may be more connected than most people would like. Now here is why this Texas event is so compelling. The Panhandle is not just any quiet patch of land. It sits near a region where the relationship between oil and gas activity, wastewater disposal, basement faults, and earthquake behavior has become increasingly difficult to dismiss in parts of Texas and neighboring states. In the Permian Basin farther south, earthquake activity has been linked in multiple discussions to industrial operations involving the deep injection of salty wastewater. But translating that general concern to a specific earthquake is harder than people think. Not every quake near industrial activity is caused by it. Not every quake away from major known operations is purely natural. Sometimes fault networks connect in ways that are not obvious from the surface. Sometimes, the timing of increased seismicity tells one story, while the local geology tells another. That is why scientists investigating the Spearman event are not simply guessing. They are trying to separate correlation from causation in a place where both may overlap. The phrase, "one of the strongest in over a century," also deserves real attention. That wording is powerful because it says this event was not just unusual for the week or for the season, it was unusual in the longer memory of the region. That should immediately change the viewer's sense of scale. The Texas Panhandle is not supposed to casually produce earthquakes that enter century-level conversations. When something crosses that threshold, even without mass damage, it becomes a warning shot. It says the baseline understanding of risk in that region may need updating. It says the event cannot be waved away as one weird morning. And it says people who treat central U.S. earthquakes like harmless oddities may be underestimating the seriousness of the pattern. Another reason this topic works so well is that it contains a hidden contradiction. The damage reports were limited, the official alert level was not apocalyptic, and yet the event still feels large in the public imagination. Why? Because seismic fear does not depend only on destruction. It depends on surprise. A moderate earthquake in a place built for earthquakes can feel manageable. A moderate earthquake in a place emotionally unprepared for them can feel far more destabilizing. People remember the sense that the map changed. They remember the phrase "Texas earthquake" sounding wrong in their heads. They remember neighbors texting each other to ask whether they felt it too. They remember being forced to imagine a hazard that had never felt central to daily life before. That is why this kind of story holds attention. It is not merely about impact. It is about a reality shift. And there is another layer here that makes the story even stronger. The Texas quake is not just a natural disaster headline. It is also an energy story. If earthquakes intersect with oil and gas infrastructure, pipelines, disposal wells, or broader industrial systems, then every tremor becomes economically and politically charged. A pipeline company checking line pressure after a quake is not just doing routine diligence. That is the energy grid touching seismic uncertainty in real time. That is the modern American economy brushing against geologic risk. Once that happens, the audience stops hearing this as a small, local tremor story. They start hearing it as a question about whether the infrastructure below America's energy ambitions is sitting on more uncertainty than the public has been told. At this point, some viewers will naturally ask whether Texas is becoming a new California. The answer is no, and saying that clearly is important. Texas is not sitting on the San Andreas system. The tectonic setting is different. The pattern, depth, and frequency of earthquakes are different. The building culture is different. But the question misses the real point anyway. Texas does not have to become California for this event to matter. It only has to become more seismically active than Texans assume. It only has to produce enough significant earthquakes in places with limited preparedness to create real concern. And it only has to demonstrate that regions tied to industrial fluid activity may need more serious scrutiny. The danger here is not that Texas suddenly copies California. The danger is that Texas may be entering its own version of a seismic conversation people are not ready to have. There is a psychological reason why the investigating why part of the title matters so much. If the title only says an earthquake happened, viewers assume the event is over. If the title says scientists are investigating why, the story becomes unfinished. That unfinished quality is what lifts retention. The audience is no longer just looking backward at something that happened. They are leaning forward toward an answer that is still forming. Was this a rare natural release on an old fault? Was it part of a changing pattern in the subsurface? Did industrial pressure changes help create the conditions for failure? Is this the beginning of more serious panhandle seismicity, or a dramatic but isolated warning? Those are all better retention questions than simply asking how strong the quake was. And because this is a long-form documentary-style script, this is where you deepen the science without losing momentum. The crust beneath Texas is not uniform, simple, or dead. Beneath the flatness of the surface lies a layered geological history of old structures, sedimentary basins, and basement faults that have been loaded, buried, and reactivated over immense spans of time. Most of the time, that deep history stays invisible, but when an earthquake happens, the hidden architecture suddenly matters. The exact fault that slipped, the stress orientation, the relation between the shallow sedimentary layers and deeper basement rocks, all of it becomes part of the explanation. That is why earthquakes in places like Texas can be scientifically fascinating. They reveal systems people were living on top of without really seeing. Then there is the shallow depth. A quake at around 5.7 kilometers is not scraping the surface, but it is shallow enough that people can feel the movement more sharply than they would from a much deeper event of similar size. Shallow earthquakes tend to concentrate the experience. The ground motion feels more immediate. The psychological shock is stronger. And in regions where people are unused to seismic shaking, that sensory surprise lands even harder. The event does not have to break apart a skyline to alter how a community feels about its own safety. A few seconds of credible, undeniable ground motion in a supposedly quiet place can do that all by itself. What also makes this event especially watchable is the debate over rarity. People hear the word rare and assume one of two extremes. Either rare means freak event, nothing to worry about, move on, or rare means the start of something terrifyingly new. In reality, rare is often the most dangerous category emotionally because it leaves room for both complacency and overreaction. A rare Texas quake can be treated as a curiosity until the next one hits, or it can be turned into instant panic without evidence. Good science sits in the harder middle. It says rare events matter precisely because they challenge the baseline. They force experts to ask whether the old probability picture still holds. They force communities to ask whether the systems around them were designed for the wrong threat mix. And they force industries to ask whether their operational footprint intersects with seismic vulnerability more than they assumed. This is also why the lack of dramatic destruction should not lull people into dismissing the event. Moderate earthquakes often play a strategic role in public awareness. They are strong enough to wake people up, but not always strong enough to force a lasting policy response. That is the dangerous zone. A catastrophic earthquake creates obvious pressure for change. A mild tremor changes nothing. But a strong regional wake-up call can fade quickly if it does not create visible ruin. That is why storytelling around a quake like this matters. The real function of the script is to preserve the seriousness of the warning, even when the visible damage does not make national television for days on end. Now consider the timing from your channel strategy point of view. Your own recent performance shows something important. The Antarctica video broke out because it combined authority, high stakes, and a time-bound warning. The Yellowstone video underperformed because it leaned more technical and narrower. The newer Texas earthquake upload quickly pulled strong early views because it hit a rare, timely event with a broad national hook and an unresolved scientific question. That tells us something very useful. Your audience does not only want doom. It wants relevance, surprise, and an active investigation. It wants topics that sound like they matter today, but still offer a mystery worth staying for. This Texas story sits exactly in that zone. The competitors reinforce that pattern. S-Zone performs best when the title combines place, danger, scientists, and a question about what happens next. Proof performs best when the title combines authority, a specific subject, and a seemingly impossible twist. This Texas quake gives you both. Place is Texas. Danger is a rare 5.0 in a region not known for it. Authority is scientists and USGS. The mystery is why it happened, and whether the old assumptions about seismic quiet are breaking down. When one topic naturally allows both formulas to merge, that is usually the signal that you are sitting on a good title and a good script premise. But to make the script really land, you have to keep pressing into the contradiction at the center of the story. Texas is not supposed to shake like this, and yet it did. The region is not known for century-scale earthquakes, and yet this was one of its strongest in more than 100 years. The county did not even have an earthquake section in its emergency planning, and yet pipelines and local infrastructure still had to be checked. The event did not cause disaster-level destruction, and yet it was serious enough to reset the conversation. Scientists do not yet have a single settled explanation, and yet the existing science already tells us enough to be concerned. Every one of those contradictions creates narrative tension, and narrative tension is what keeps viewers watching a 25-minute documentary instead of clicking away after the first minute. Here is another important rehook. The scariest part of the Texas earthquake may not be the shaking people felt. It may be the possibility that the ground is revealing stress patterns the public has been ignoring because they did not fit the old map of where earthquakes belong. Once that sentence lands, the story gets bigger instantly. It is no longer about one county. It is about whether the American interior is changing in ways that are easier to measure than to emotionally absorb. It is about whether the country's energy landscape, waste disposal practices, and buried fault architecture are interacting in ways that demand a more honest public discussion. And it is about whether our cultural image of seismic safety is years behind the data. That does not mean the answer will turn out to be dramatic in the most sensational sense. Scientists may eventually conclude that this was a largely natural event on a fault capable of occasional activity without any decisive industrial trigger. That remains possible. But even if that is the final explanation, the quake still matters because it proves that the Panhandle can produce stronger shaking than most people in the region have built their expectations around. In other words, even the least sensational interpretation still forces an update. And if the investigation points toward human influence, then the implications become even wider, because the event would join a much bigger American conversation about how energy production and subsurface hazard can intersect. This is also where the audience's instinct to oversimplify becomes dangerous. Some people want every earthquake in an energy-producing state to be blamed instantly on drilling. Others want every discussion of induced seismicity to be treated as political theater. Both reactions miss the point. The real issue is not whether one side can use the quake to score a narrative win. The real issue is whether the underlying system is being measured honestly. Faults do not care about ideology. Pressure changes do not care about branding. If a disposal practice raises seismic risk, the ground will eventually say so. If a buried natural fault was loaded enough to move on its own, the ground will say that too. The job of science is to listen carefully enough to tell the difference, or at least narrow the possibilities with integrity. Another element that makes the Texas event so engaging is the sense of scale mismatch. A 5.0 earthquake is not globally enormous. In some tectonic regions, it is notable but not shocking. In the Texas Panhandle, it is exactly the kind of number that breaks the emotional frame of the region. The same magnitude means different things in different places because vulnerability, expectation, and infrastructure vary. That is why national audiences pay attention to anomalies. They are instinctively aware that a quake is not just a number. It is a number inside a setting. A 5.0 in a place where people are not prepared for 5.0 level shaking is a very different story than a 5.0 in a place built with earthquakes in mind. And let us talk about what happens after a quake like this, because that is another retention driver competitors use well. The event itself is the hook, but the aftermath is the real narrative engine. Inspectors look at pipelines, residents check foundations, scientists examine whether aftershocks emerge. Data teams refine the event parameters. People compare it to earlier regional quakes. Newsrooms start asking how often this has happened before, why it seems more common in recent years, and whether the increase since 2020 reflects a real shift in Texas seismicity. The initial shaking is only a few seconds. The interpretive aftermath can run for days or weeks. That is where the documentary value lives. The statistic that a large share of Texas earthquakes of magnitude 2.5 or greater have occurred since 2020 is especially powerful because it compresses a trend into one memorable line. Whether the causes vary by region, that number alone tells the viewer this is not just an old background pattern continuing unchanged. Something about the seismic conversation in Texas has intensified in recent years. Once viewers hear that, they stop treating the Panhandle quake like a random novelty. It begins to feel like a signal inside a larger arc. And whenever a single dramatic event can be placed inside a broader trend, the story becomes much stronger and much stickier. At this stage, a viewer might ask the most practical question of all. If more places in Texas can shake, what should people actually do with that information? The answer is not to panic and pretend the whole state has turned into a seismic battlefield. The answer is to treat low-probability, high-surprise hazards more seriously. That means better regional monitoring, more transparent data around industrial activity where relevant, stronger coordination between energy operators and seismic researchers, and a more realistic public understanding that not famous for earthquakes is not the same as immune to earthquakes. It also means local emergency plans should no longer assume that earthquakes are someone else's emergency. Even a modest amount of planning can matter enormously in places that currently have almost none. Now step back for a second and look at why this is such a strong trend topic overall. It merges the emotional power of a breaking disaster with the sustained curiosity of an unresolved science mystery. It also widens your brand in a smart way. You stay inside the geoplanet lane of Earth systems, geology, risk, and planetary scale forces, but you also tap into the faster-moving urgency that has been driving competitor performance. It is grounded, it is searchable, it is current, and it naturally supports a strong hook without needing exaggeration. You do not have to invent danger. The surprise is already there. Texas shook hard enough to break the region's expectations, and scientists are investigating whether that says something larger about the ground beneath America's energy heartland. And maybe that is the core reason people will keep clicking on stories like this. Earthquakes strip away comfort quickly. They do not ask whether a place thinks of itself as seismic. They do not wait for the public imagination to catch up. They just happen. Then afterward, people rush to explain them, categorize them, minimize them, dramatize them, and make them fit the world they thought they knew the day before. The Texas quake refuses to fit neatly. It is too strong to ignore, too unusual to feel normal, too scientifically open to feel settled, and too tied to a broader debate about induced earthquakes to be dismissed as an isolated curiosity. It sits in that perfect zone where one event can force a much bigger reckoning. So when we say Texas just had one of its strongest quakes in over a century, we are not only describing a statistic, we are describing a moment when an entire region's mental map cracked a little. A shallow 5.0 near Spearman, felt by hundreds of people and strong enough to raise pipeline concerns and emergency questions, is not just a tremor. It is a signal. Maybe it is a signal about buried natural faults. Maybe it is a signal about how industrial activity can interact with pre-existing stress. Maybe it is a signal about how outdated our public understanding of safe geography has become. Most likely, it is a signal about all three at once. And that brings us to the cleanest ending for this story. The Texas Panhandle earthquake matters because it was rare, strong, shallow, and surprising. It matters because it struck a region that does not think of itself as earthquake country. It matters because the infrastructure there is too important to treat seismic questions casually. It matters because USGS and other researchers have spent years showing that induced seismicity in parts of the central United States is a real scientific problem worth tracking carefully. And it matters because even if this specific quake turns out to be mostly natural, it still proves that the old public map of where meaningful earthquakes belong is no longer good enough. Texas was never supposed to shake like this. That is exactly why everyone is paying attention now. The quake woke people up physically for a few seconds, but it may have done something even more lasting intellectually. It may have forced Texans, energy operators, scientists, and the wider public to admit that the ground beneath the Panhandle deserves more respect, more scrutiny, and less assumption than it used to get. The shaking itself is already over. The investigation is not. And until scientists can say with much more confidence why this happened and what it means for what comes next, this story is not really about one quake anymore. It is about a state, a region, and a country realizing that some of the most important warnings do not come from the places we expect. They come from the places we thought were quiet.